I was told that my old friend Whatifalthist released a new video on the anthropology of the right, so I decided to watch that video, and actually it was a pretty good video. I really agreed with some parts of it, but of course I'm going to focus on the parts that I don't agree with, and I want to further expand on some points, like I don't think that some points that he made are not correct. I just think that they need to be expanded further. But okay, let us start. Let us start.
Latin America is not a story of the glory of human nature or progress. Many revolutions have come and gone, but even those who work just make the dictators into a new nobility, and the communists treat the common people even worse than the old nobility did.
Well, okay, what I liked about the beginning of his video, if you haven't watched his video already, I just want to give you a short summary. So he starts with explaining various types of conservatism that exist, and he actually acknowledges that in Latin America and that in many parts of the world, conservatism is just preserving the old super hierarchical, unequal, often racist system. And in Latin America, for example, he went with the Batista regime comparison. What was like right? What was conservatism in the Batista regime? It was just preserving this very unequal land hierarchy that existed, that left many people unsatisfied. And okay, now he argues that well, communism in Latin America, after doing a revolution and redistributing some wealth, actually often led only to an even worse society, an even worse hierarchy than what existed before. But I would actually strongly disagree with it, at least when it comes to Cuba. So, look, I'm not saying that Cuban authoritarianism is good. I'm grateful that I live in a liberal democratic society, but I definitely think that the Cuban regime was better than the Batista regime. So, why is that the case? Well, I would even make a very, let's say, nationalist point that at least the Cuban people could say, well, at least now we have our own dictator and not just an American puppet. Because you should keep in mind Castro was not a Soviet puppet. He was an ally of the Soviets, but he did not always just blindly listen to the Soviets. So the Soviets even had trouble controlling him during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's why Castro actually joined the non-aligned movement. So, at least in theory, he was non-aligned. He wasn't in the Soviet sphere of influence. But okay, let us continue.
British rightism. It's funny that we call this group conservative, given it's also liberal at the exact same time. This confusion is due to deliberate strategies on the part of the left to obfuscate terminology to confuse people so that no one can actually understand what the left is trying to say. Thus, the left can do whatever they want and not be held accountable for anything.
Well, not everything is a conspiracy. That's my problem with recent Whatifalthist videos. He seems to think that some things that just occurred naturally, like the, let's say, culture, especially Hollywood, becoming more leftist, that is a conspiracy. That just occurred naturally in the same way. Like, the fact that the word liberal can mean like a leftist, and it can also mean a Mitt Romney type Republican. That's not a conspiracy. That's just how we use words. I mean, imagine if the leftist strategy truly was, as he said, to make people not understand what they are saying. Like, what a brilliant 4D chess move! Like, you want your ideology to spread, so you have to, so you have to make it so that nobody understands what you are doing. Like, brilliant, brilliant.
That's why the phrase liberal means 4 different things depending on who you ask. However, for this video, we mean liberal in its first meaning. That is, like the British Empire or the American Founding Fathers. Limited government intervention in society or the economy with a liberal democracy, property rights, and freedom as the dominant values. I'm calling this British rightism given it was first developed and championed there, alongside the Netherlands. Although, ironically, Britain has basically completely deviated from this, with America practically being the only country with any semblance of this anymore, even though it's fighting a desperate defensive campaign against leftism. The greatest target of leftism at this point, ironically more so than even genocidal or legitimately misogynistic regimes, is the old school British conservatives. The left loathes every part of their social order and has spent the last century more trying to destroy even the memory of their existence. It's funny to hear that Francis Fukuyama in the 1990s basically predicted that British-style rightist regimes had unilaterally won history due to achieving such perfection and domination. Classical liberal regimes have property rights, parliaments, individualism, and a free market. The great irony was that, like all successful organisms, British rightism was so successful as to cause its own demise. This is a pattern we'll find.
Okay, so let me actually even agree with Whatifalthist on something, and that is, I think that it's a bit silly for leftists to hate some classical liberals so much. For example, Churchill. Let's go with Churchill. We both agree that that's the type of British liberal conservatism that Whatifalthist is talking about. So, okay, yeah, I do think that on the one hand, we should also mention like that he did some bad things, like the Bengal famines happened under him and stuff like that, but removing Churchill statues is really dumb in my opinion, because then you're limiting yourself to very few people that did absolutely nothing wrong, which is pretty much nobody in history. I mean, by that logic, all US presidents that existed before segregation was abolished are evil, which makes no sense. But yeah, I mean, Churchill, where I truly admire Churchill. So he refused to make peace with Hitler at a time when I would even say many rational people would. Because, so there was this period before the Soviets entered the war and before Americans entered the war. And it really seemed like, how will the British Empire stand alone against Japan, Italy, and Hitler? And even Mussolini, the most incompetent guy in the war, managed to conquer Somalia from the British. So it really looked like this is not going well. But Churchill then just decided to bet against all odds that surely the United States will join us in a few years, and Hitler might attack Stalin, so we'll stay in the war. And yeah, that kind of courage is something that should be admired. But okay, we can continue.
Since the underlying difference was that the British Enlightenment believed that human nature was flawed, while the French that it was perfectible. This is, in fact, the start of the whole divide between the right and the left as a global conflict, between Britain and France at the time of the French Revolution. You could argue that the right and the left division comes out of the mercantilist versus capitalist division, which Britain and France fought each other over between the 30 Years' War and the French Revolution.
Okay, just to expand a bit on this point, so I would agree that the French Revolution, in a way, it was very similar to communism, and Lenin even compared himself to the French revolutionaries. But okay, there are some crucial differences also. So Lenin actually said that the French Revolution never fulfilled its promise of equality. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. So the égalité part, according to the communists, was never fulfilled. But okay, now, okay, this is interesting. He starts talking about the terms left and right, and okay, just to drop an interesting fact on you, the terms politically left and politically right they come from the French Revolution. So in the French Revolution, the people that were on the right were pro-monarchy, and the leftists were all people against the monarchy. So that's what originally leftism and rightism meant. Then, as history continued, it became very confusing, I would say, and it even remains to be very confusing today, because there are multiple then fractions on the left. For example, some leftists are Marxists, others are just liberals that are social democrats but still call themselves leftists. Then there are anarchists, so anarchists, historically speaking, like Kropotkin, a leftist anarchist, where he disagreed with the communists, is he wanted to skip the dictatorship of the proletariat phase, like that Marx argued was necessary. So Kropotkin, for example, as Bakunin said, we shouldn't have this phase where state takes control of pretty much everything in order to reach this utopia that is stateless. That's the paradox of Marxism. It wants to create a stateless society by making a state stronger in the beginning. But, for example, Bakunin and Kropotkin argued, no, let's just abolish the state immediately. But okay, they still do differ from libertarians because they wanted to collectivize property. Now, how do you do that? Well, Kropotkin even argued, which is interesting, that in Russia that could work. Why? Because under feudalism, Russian peasant families, even they collectively owned their farms. So individual property, in a sense in which it existed in the West, never really existed in Russia before, let's say, Putin and Yeltsin. So it existed for a short amount of time in the countryside. I'm speaking about the countryside. So it existed for a very short time between the Stolypin reforms in the early 1900s and the Bolsheviks taking power. But that's a very short time period. But okay, we can continue.
This is taboo to say, but it doesn't stop it from being true. Within a generation of universal suffrage, Europe went from one of the most important places in the world politically, economically, socially, technologically, and militarily to none of those things. Meanwhile, universal suffrage worked much better in America, where most people were property owners or stakeholders.
Okay, but let me explain why Europe became much less powerful than it used to be after adopting universal suffrage. So it's not for the reasons that Whatifalthist seems to imply here. He says that in America it worked better because most people were property owners and more religious. Well, yeah, I would disagree with that. So what happened in the Cold War period? So in the Cold War period, and some would even say a bit before, after World War I, roughly speaking, oil became the most important substance in the world. And it's not a coincidence that therefore two of the largest superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States, also had control of most of the world's oil. And also, well, decolonization happened. That's also where Europe lost a lot of its power. Well, why did the decolonization happen? Well, European economies, so primarily British and the French, and the Dutch economy, got so damaged in World War II because of Hitler just attacking them and stealing their resources and killing a lot of young men, which happened to be the most productive demographic in a society. So their economies were so damaged that they couldn't really fight against the colonial people rising up. And also, for the first time in history, there was this huge superpower called the Soviet Union that decided to help pretty much every single anti-colonial movement that existed. Now, of course, they were doing it not not purely, let's say, altruistic motives, but still they did it. And yeah, that's why anti-colonial revolutions were successful, because in the early 1900s, let's say, when Morocco rebelled against the French, well, okay, the Germans supported it in the beginning, but they said, we will stop supporting Morocco if you give us Congo. And then the French gave Congo to the German Kaiser, and the Germans stopped supporting Morocco. But with the Soviets, they were much more fanatical about supporting anti-colonialism. So you couldn't just give them territory in order for them to stop. That was the difference. But okay, let us continue.
There's this whole debate that's gone back decades about whether or not Nazis and fascists are right-wing. It ends up falling into Sitch's law, or most debates are at the definition of a term, in that whether or not the Nazis are right-wing really depends on what definition of right-wing you're using. I personally think that the Nazis are conservative, and I think people who push against this are mostly libertarians and classical liberals who are tired of the left using the Nazi smear against British rightists who are really different. However, when I look at the Nazis, I see people who support their tribe first, sexual and class hierarchies, social traditions, and other traits that are very clearly rightist. It's also clear that if you put a gun to a classical liberal or libertarian's head and make them choose between fascism and communism, they'll almost always choose fascism. One of my definitions for whether you're on the right or the left is, if someone puts a gun to your head, will you push for Marxism or some nationalist ideology?
Yeah, okay, I actually think that he was very objective in this part of the video, and what I also want to emphasize is that, okay, why do some people, like libertarians or let's say Ben Shapiro type conservatives, think that Nazism was kind of leftist? Well, because Hitler also promised wealth redistribution. There is that famous Nazi poster that says, we are building free homes for the youth. Also, during mass unemployment in the Weimar Republic, the Nazi party was giving free beer and food to the German people. But okay, those things Hitler did because he knew those things were insanely popular, and he also realized that liberals are not really helping the common man, giving him food and beer. Yeah, so he realized that wealth redistribution is very popular. But okay, just to just to kind of argue a bit against the let's say Ben Shapiro types that would argue that Nazism was socialist. Okay, I mean, in its name it did have socialism, but why we hate Nazism today, most reasonable people hate it, is not because Hitler gave free beer to the German people or stuff like that. It's because Nazism was extremely racist, expansionist, militaristic, nationalist, discriminatory. That's why we dislike Nazism. But okay, we can continue.
It's also beyond bizarre to see the alliance that's developed between the left and radical Islam. I think it's a one-sided crush on the part of the left due to hating white Western civilization so much. The Muslims view the left with contempt and use the relationship whenever it's convenient for them, while the left sees them as useful allies. This is something Philippe Fabry, who's a fan of the show, brilliantly predicted, called the Islamo-leftism, which I thought was too insane to be real, but he was correct, and here we are. Islamo-leftism is most popular in Europe due to the strange politics in which the incentive is for the left to ally with Muslims. A reason I put this group in is that I wanted to represent the religious fundamentalist faction of the right. The left likes to imagine Christian religious fundamentalists totally dominate American society. That's not really true, in that yes, the Bible Belt is an important faction and backer for the Republicans, but they're not the ruling class or driving force. America is not going to become a Christian fundamentalist state anytime soon unless a massive movement forms.
Okay, yeah, I actually agree with Whatifalthist that this alliance between the left and radical Islam is kind of bizarre. But many times in history, we see these, as they're called, trans-ideological alliances for example, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. That was very bizarre when it happened. And an even better example of that is currently the Taliban are being financed by China. So what's bizarre about it? Well, China is currently doing a genocide of Uyghur Muslims, and the Taliban seem not to really care about it because the Chinese investors are investing into the Afghan economy, and they desperately need investment because the United States is refusing to trade with them, and yeah, that's not good for them. So yeah, they are kind of dependent on China. This was fascinating to me. They even stopped destroying Buddha statues in Afghanistan because they were afraid that Chinese investors might not like it. So that's how powerful actually money can be, let's say, or shared interests can be. And yeah, I do agree that there is something hypocritical about leftists and radical Islamists being in an alliance, because at the end of the day, when I ask myself, like, would I rather live under the Taliban or under some sort of Christian nationalism, I think I would choose Christian nationalism. Like in most cases, at least. It depends on what exactly we're talking about. But okay, now I would be interested in hearing what Whatifalthist and some of his fans have to say about Andrew Tate. Okay, why am I mentioning Andrew Tate in this context? Well, Andrew Tate, in my humble opinion, kind of decided to try and make an alliance between the right-wingers and Muslim fanatics, Muslim radicals. He seems to be saying, like, wokeness is such a problem that Muslims and conservatives should unite. But again, like, I would then ask the conservatives the same question: would you rather live under a woke society or under the Taliban? And if the answer is under a woke society, then it's not really smart to ally with radical Islamists. But okay, tell me in the comment section, did I misunderstand Andrew Tate? And how do you view Andrew Tate's ideology, if there even is a clear ideology? Because on the one hand, he's definitely not a like Sharia law type of person. He brags about having a lot of promiscuous sex, which is like haram, let's say, which like you lose your head in most Muslim societies for doing that. And also for like doing pornography and stuff like that's not allowed. But okay, at the same time, he claims to be Muslim, and interestingly, he's also very pro-Palestine. But okay, enough about Andrew Tate. So let's continue.
There are 4 different groups which fight the left for different reasons. Peruvian conservatives fight against the left given they are the status quo and they stand to lose if the left wins. An example of a conflict like this is the French Revolution. The second form, British conservatives, fight against leftism given they support property rights, freedom, and an open market, since they are driven by the merchant classes.
Okay. I would disagree with Elon Musk being the latter group. I think he's what Whatifalthist describes as Peruvian right-winger. He wants to keep his wealth, therefore he realizes that Republicans are going to make taxes lower for him. Also, what's interesting about Trump, his entire life he voted for the Democrats until he became actually a Republican candidate. So I do think that at the core of Trumpism, at least from Trump's perspective, is doing whatever will give him more power, actually. So yeah, I don't think that, like, Trump, okay, he maybe has some even genuine beliefs on immigration, that it should be more restricted, and I think he genuinely fears China, but I think that his main motive is just gaining power. But okay, obviously me and Whatifalthist disagree about it.
The left wants to remove the merchant classes. An example of this kind of conflict is the current American culture war, fought between the left and classical liberal American conservatives. For the longest period, it's a conflict between consensus liberals versus classical liberals, although both sides have become less liberal over the last 5 years.
Okay, just a quick intervention. Like, the left does not want to remove the merchant classes. Like, if we are talking about democratic parties in liberal systems, like the far left wants to do it, the communists want to do it, but Obama is funded by the merchant class, just like Kamala Harris, just like Joe Biden, just like the Republicans. Yeah, they don't want to remove the merchant class, but okay, let's continue.
German rightists fight the left since their power is based off a martial and masculine warlike culture. The left would destroy the national cultures upon which their societies are founded. An example of that conflict is World War II on the Eastern Front, fought between Stalinist Russia and Nazi Germany. The final battle, that between radical Islam and the left, occurs to them being too much of competitors. You can't have two messianic ideologies in the same society, and radical Islam or communism both demand the complete souls of their followers. An example of this, in turn, is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. I know many of the brightest minds of the right are watching this video.
Okay, and let me just finish with an interesting observation about the Soviet-Afghan War. So, the Soviet-Afghan War, yes, it was a clash of jihadism and fanatical communism. Partially, it was just a clash over territory, over resources. Yeah, partially it wasn't an ideological fight, but in a way it was. And here I disagree with Whatifalthist. I don't see it like as what he said, as a fight of almost two fanatical religions that want to completely dominate your life. Although that is a valid way of looking at the conflict, but to me, the Soviet invasion is actually kind of similar to the American invasion of Afghanistan, because in both cases, both superpowers could make the case that radical Islam was a threat to their nation, that they need to intervene in order to stop the spread of radical Islam, of Wahhabism, and both countries had this idea that they need to civilize this, as they would say, barbaric population. And look, I personally would be against forcing people to accept new values too soon. And there is always a risk if you force somebody to do something, you are just causing them to accept the opposite ideology out of spite, which is kind of what happened in Afghanistan with jihadism becoming more popular as a consequence of the Soviet invasion. But yeah, the Soviets also did see themselves as a civilizing force in Afghanistan. For example, they prohibited child marriage, which in and of itself is good. But yeah, I don't think that like killing somewhere around 2 million Afghan civilians in that invasion can be justified by saying, yeah, well, we also did some good things. For example, the Soviets, they also proclaimed gender equality in Afghanistan, and not some crazy notion of gender equality like everybody needs to be trans. No, like they just proclaimed that men and women are equal under the law, which all liberal countries also claim. So yeah, and here I want to actually end with the observation: liberalism and communism, they are very different, but they are both in a way, and this is actually something that I believe Richard Overy says, like both Marxism and liberalism are children of the French Revolution. They both believe in equality of man, while many other ideologies, such as fascism, for example, or some radical forms of theocracy, they don't believe in equality of all men. And yeah, in that aspect, I actually would compare the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan with the American invasion, although the Soviets were much more brutal and they cared much less about civilian casualties. But then again, back then, let's just say that it wasn't such a taboo to kill so many civilians, partially because, well, due to a lack of social media, people couldn't really see it and talk about it, like today with the Gaza war or with the Ukraine war, not to mention that the Soviets, they kind of still remember the Vietnam War, so in their mind, like, who are the Americans to criticize us? But okay, yeah, I actually want to just end by saying that I actually agreed with many things in this video, but yeah, I also decided to point out some of my disagreements with Whatifalthist. Okay, and if you like this video, don't forget to like, share and subscribe.